Mark Delaney was the officer everyone trusted, the rising star of his small-town police force until one careless decision inside a dimly lit antique shop turned him from hero to cautionary tale overnight. Officer Mark Delaney had always been the kind of person people noticed. Even as a young recruit, there was something about his steady voice, his sharp uniform, and the way he carried himself that made others think he was built for bigger things. He was quick on his feet, rarely hesitated in tough situations, and had a natural way of gaining the trust of both his colleagues and the people he served. For a small town that didn't see much action beyond the occasional shoplifting or bar fight, Mark was a breath of fresh air. He represented hope, progress, and the idea that maybe their police department could stand shoulder to shoulder with those in bigger cities. Mark wasn't just doing his job, he was building a reputation. His reports were always neat and thorough, his arrests clean and by the book. Supervisors talked about him in meetings, sometimes using his name as an example of how a young officer should conduct themselves. Older officers admired his energy, and newer recruits often looked up to him like a mentor, despite the fact that he was only a few years into the job himself. The community adored him too. People waved when they saw his cruiser drive down Main Street. He was invited to charity events, asked to speak at schools, and even praised in the local paper for helping a stranded motorist in the middle of a snowstorm. But beneath the praise and admiration, there was something else growing inside him. Mark liked the attention, maybe a little too much. Every pat on the back, every word of encouragement from his sergeant, every thank you note from a grateful citizen added fuel to a fire he didn't know how to control. He began to believe he was different, destined for more than routine patrols and traffic stops. While most officers were content to do their shifts and go home, Mark dreamed of promotions, titles, and recognition that stretched far beyond the borders of his quiet town. He began volunteering for extra shifts, often pushing himself to exhaustion just to be seen as dependable. He offered to take difficult calls, ones other officers dreaded, because he knew those moments made stories that traveled quickly through the department. If a drunk driver resisted arrest or a suspect fled on foot, Mark was always the first to respond, the first to bring things under control, and the first to file a spotless report afterward. Slowly, he built a reputation not just as a good cop, but as the cop someone who was always one step ahead. Still, ambition has a way of clouding judgment. For Mark, the line between doing good work and chasing recognition started to blur. The more people praised him, the more he wanted to hold on to that image of perfection. He began to fear slipping up, not because of the consequences, but because it would mean losing the admiration he thrived on. He wanted to be the officer whose name people remembered, the one everyone trusted with the biggest cases, the one destined for detective work and beyond. That hunger grew with each day, and though it seemed harmless, it set the stage for decisions that would unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. What no one realized, not his supervisors, not his fellow officers, not even Mark himself, was that beneath the shining surface of his career, cracks were already forming. Small, invisible cracks that would widen with time. And when they finally broke open, they would not only shatter his future, but stain the very image he had carefully built for himself. It was late on a rainy Thursday night when the call came through. Dispatch reported a burglary in progress at Harrington's Antique Shop, a place well known in town for its rare and unusual items. The shop had been in business for decades, its shelves filled with everything from old furniture to glass cases of collectible coins. For most officers, responding to a break-in there would have been just another routine assignment, but for Mark, it felt like the kind of call that could set him apart. He threw on his lights and sirens, pushing through the slick streets, picturing the headlines if he were the one to catch the suspect in the act. When he arrived, the back door was already ajar, the lock pried open with force. Rainwater dripped from the ceiling onto the wooden floor, the storm outside echoing inside the dim building. Mark stepped carefully, flashlight sweeping across the scene. Shelves were overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, and boxes of old papers dumped carelessly in piles. It was clear someone had been searching for something of value, though in their hurry they had left behind more than they had taken. Near the center of the shop, Mark's light caught the glint of silver. A small velvet-lined box lay open on the ground, its contents spilled out. Dozens of antique coins, each with markings and dates he didn't recognize, were scattered like forgotten marbles across the floorboards. He crouched down, running his gloved hand over one of them, admiring the craftsmanship and the weight of history behind it. For a moment, it didn't feel like evidence, it felt like treasure. He told himself it wasn't unusual to admire items at a crime scene. Every officer felt curiosity when faced with something rare or valuable. But curiosity turned quickly into temptation. He lingered longer than he should have, staring at the coins, imagining their worth, not just in money but in uniqueness. One coin in particular caught his eye, its edges sharp, its face shimmering even under the weak beam of his flashlight. Without stopping to think, he slipped it into his pocket. It was an instinctive decision, the kind of action made in a fraction of a second, and the weight of it against his leg immediately filled him with a strange mix of thrill and dread. Mark convinced himself it wasn't really a big deal. Nobody would miss one coin among dozens. The burglar had already done the damage, and in the chaos of broken glass and overturned shelves, who could say exactly what had been taken? In his mind, it felt harmless, almost invisible. He carefully placed the rest of the coins back in the box, bagged it as evidence, and wrote up his notes as if nothing had happened. By the time he returned to the station, he had tucked the coin away in his locker, hidden under his spare gloves. What he didn't realize was that Harrington's wasn't just any antique shop. The owner had recently installed a new security system after a series of thefts in the area. Cameras had been placed discreetly in corners, covering angles even the burglars hadn't noticed. The footage captured everything, not just the break-in, but also the quiet moments when Officer Mark Delaney lingered a little too long near the display case, his hand hovering, his body shifting in a way that would later raise questions. At that moment, he thought he had taken something insignificant. In reality, he had taken the first step down a path that would change his career forever. For several days after the burglary call, everything seemed to move forward without issue. Mark carried out his shifts as usual, wrote his reports, and exchanged easy small talk with colleagues who still saw him as the department's rising star. He walked through the station with the same calm confidence he always had, and no one suspected a thing. The coin remained tucked away in his locker, hidden beneath a pile of spare gear. To him, it felt like a personal keepsake, a secret no one else needed to know about. The case of the antique shop burglary was passed on to detectives, who began their follow-up investigation with the usual diligence. They walked through the store again with the owner, photographing every corner, comparing what was damaged with what was stolen. That's when a troubling detail surfaced. The shopkeeper was adamant that his prized coin collection had been untouched before the burglary. According to him, none of the suspects could have gotten to it without leaving obvious marks, yet several of the rarer coins were suddenly missing. The detectives found themselves facing a strange puzzle. The burglars hadn't taken them, but the coins were gone nonetheless. The next step was obvious. They reviewed the security footage. Hours of grainy black and white recordings revealed the break-in, the figures in hooded jackets rummaging through shelves, and their hasty escape. But when the detectives slowed the footage and studied the aftermath, something caught their attention. The camera in the corner captured Mark entering the shop alone, his flashlight beam moving across the floor. At one point, he knelt by the scattered coins, staying there longer than expected. His movements weren't overt, but there was a hesitation in the way his arms shifted, his shadow blocking the view for just a moment too long. It wasn't enough to accuse him outright, but it raised eyebrows. Whispers began in the station, nothing direct, nothing spoken too loudly, but detectives exchanged looks and subtle comments when Mark's name came up. For a man who built his career on trust and admiration, the change in tone was almost invisible at first. But cracks had formed in the image he had worked so hard to protect. He didn't know it yet, but the investigation was slowly turning inward, circling closer to him with each piece of evidence reviewed. The missing coins became the sticking point of the case. Detectives rechecked the property photos taken after the burglary, comparing them to older inventory lists. The pattern was undeniable. The burglar had ignored the coin collection entirely. Yet the final evidence bag contained fewer items than it should have. Every possibility was considered, from clerical error to oversight, but each road led back to one uncomfortable conclusion. The only person who had been alone with the coins was Officer Mark Delaney. Still, accusing a respected officer wasn't something the department took lightly. There needed to be certainty and deniable proof. Internal Affairs was quietly informed, and they began paying closer attention to Mark's calls and behavior. He remained unaware of the growing suspicion, going about his duties with the same polished efficiency as always. But the walls were closing in piece by piece as the evidence pointed steadily in his direction. The secret coin in his locker, the one he believed was invisible, had already started to unravel the reputation he valued more than anything else. The unease surrounding Mark didn't fade with time. Instead, it grew heavier, pressing down on the department as questions lingered without clear answers. Detectives and Internal Affairs needed proof, something beyond the blurry pause in the antique shop footage or the missing coins on the inventory sheet. The suspicion was strong, but suspicion wasn't enough to ruin a man's career. They wanted something undeniable, and they wanted to be certain that Mark's actions were not just a one-time lapse but part of a dangerous pattern. The decision was made to set a trap, a staged test designed to reveal the truth. The opportunity came on a quiet evening when Mark was dispatched to what looked like another routine call. A property owner had reported signs of forced entry in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The place had been empty for years, often used by trespassers or teenagers looking for somewhere hidden to gather. What Mark didn't know was that the scene had been carefully staged. The door was left partially open, the inside scattered with boxes and random belongings planted to look like valuable loot. Hidden cameras were placed in corners, their lenses waiting to capture every movement. Mark approached with his usual confidence, flashlight in hand, scanning the space with professional care. To any outside observer, he looked exactly like the officer he had always claimed to be: calm, methodical, alert. But when his beam of light caught the glimmer of jewelry on a table, the true test began. There, among the clutter, was a small pile of watches, necklaces, and a delicate gold bracelet placed deliberately to catch his eye. He hesitated just as he had with the coins, his breath slowed, his hand hovering. The cameras recorded every second of that pause, every flicker of temptation written across his posture. And then, without a second thought, he slipped the bracelet into his pocket. He believed the space was deserted, that no one was watching. To him, it was just another harmless souvenir, an object no one would miss. But to Internal Affairs, it was the moment they had been waiting for. When Mark returned to his cruiser, he felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and secrecy, the thrill of holding on to something forbidden. But the drive back to the station was unlike any other. As soon as he stepped inside, he was met not with routine chatter but with stern faces and quiet tension. Supervisors and investigators were waiting for him. Without a word, they asked him to empty his pockets. The bracelet glinted under the harsh station lights as it was laid on the table. Then came the footage clearer than anything from the antique shop, irrefutable, undeniable. Every angle, every motion, every choice he made in that warehouse had been recorded. The room was silent as he realized there was nothing left to defend himself with. He had walked directly into their test, and in doing so, had exposed himself completely. In that instant, the weight of what he had done hit him harder than anything before. The pride, the ambition, the image he had built, it all collapsed in seconds. He knew there was no way back, no explanation that could erase what they had seen. With a single impulsive act, he had given up the very career he believed he was destined to lead. The silence that filled the room after the bracelet was placed on the table was heavier than anything Mark had ever experienced. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed shock or confusion, it was the silence of certainty. Everyone there knew exactly what they had just witnessed, and so did he. The young officer who once represented the department's brightest future now stood as a man exposed, caught in the very act of betraying the badge he wore. For years, he had imagined his career unfolding into promotions, recognition, maybe even leadership someday. Instead, it ended with a single piece of jewelry sitting under the unforgiving light of an interrogation room. His badge was taken from him immediately, along with his service weapon. The gesture was simple, procedural, but it cut deeper than any punishment could. To Mark, handing over that badge was like surrendering a piece of himself, a symbol of everything he had believed he was. There were no words of defense, no explanations that could lessen the weight of what had been proven. He had been caught twice now, once in suspicion and once in undeniable evidence. The second time sealed his fate. News of his downfall spread quickly through the department. Officers who once admired him avoided eye contact. Some shook their heads in disappointment, others whispered in frustration at how one man's greed could stain the reputation of them all. The community, too, reacted with disbelief when the story reached the papers. For many residents, Mark had been a trusted figure, someone they believed stood for integrity and safety. The betrayal stung far worse than the theft itself. The coin and bracelet were minor compared to the collapse of trust he left behind. Though Mark avoided jail time by cooperating fully, the damage was irreversible. He was dismissed from the force, stripped of any possibility of returning to law enforcement. Other departments were informed, ensuring that no agency would risk hiring him again. His name, once spoken with pride, became a cautionary reminder, a quiet example repeated in training sessions about the dangers of temptation and arrogance. For new recruits, his story was told not as gossip, but as a warning how quickly a promising career can unravel when an officer forgets that the badge is a responsibility, not a privilege to exploit. Mark's personal life suffered just as harshly. Friends distanced themselves, neighbors avoided conversation, and even family struggled to understand how someone who had been so full of potential could throw it all away for something so small. The coin and the bracelet were worth little in the grand scheme of things, but the choices behind them carried a cost greater than he ever imagined. The ambition that once pushed him forward had blinded him, and in chasing recognition, he had destroyed everything that recognition was built on. For Mark Delaney, the end didn't come with a dramatic chase or a violent confrontation. It came in quiet moments of weakness, in the split-second decisions that revealed his true character. He walked into his career with the promise of greatness, but he walked out with nothing more than a cautionary tale attached to his name. His fall wasn't loud or heroic, it was quiet, calculated, and complete.